Buckley, so welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be talking through Victorian versus Regency stories. I'm going to be sticking to fantasy today because obviously as soon as we start getting into historical, then I have to start going through any criticisms that I might have. And I am already well known enough for ranting about the Victorians on my channel. So today instead, we're just going to be talking about fantasy books that are inspired by the different time periods. So be it the Regency era or by the Victorian era. Now, a couple of these that I have under Victorian kind of fall a little bit more under the reign of William, who is in between the Regency and the Victorians, especially if you count the Regency up to the end of the reign of George IV, which I personally don't. So we're going to go a little tiny smidgen of context in here, just so you know what I'm talking about in a historical sense, and then we will talk through a little bit just about some of the fantasy books that are set in those time periods. Now, this is obviously a very specific time period, and I'm also going to be talking about books that are mostly dealing with upper classes, right? So books that are specifically tackling high society. Think Bridgerton, right? With that in mind, if you would like me to do just a video talking about fantasy books that are inspired by general different time periods of mostly British, I'm afraid to say, history, then I can definitely do a list of those if you'd find that interesting. Just me going from prehistory until now in Britain and seeing the different ways that history is depicted in fantasy and doing a chat about it. Do one of these, grab yourself a tea and chat kind of history things. I'm more than happy to do so. There are areas that are not quite in my expertise, but I should be able to at least give you a general idea of what has inspired the fantasy sections of the books. So yeah, if you want a more broad history one, then do let me know. I know that I am kind of known a little bit more for my Regency versus Victorian videos at the minute, so I thought I'd start with this one, and then if you would just like a broader one, then do let me know in the comments down below. But today, yes, we're going to be going through all of my different recommendations for fantasy Regency and fantasy Victorian books. I'm going to do timestamps down below, so if you want to skip straight to the book recommendations, feel free to do so. For those of you who would like a little bit of historical context about why I'm dividing these two up specifically, I'm going to chat about it. I do have a rant video where I talk about why the distinction is important to me, and it has nothing to do with gatekeeping or anything to do with getting angry at people who don't know their stuff. It's no snobbery. It's more my issue is when they are placed on the same lists as opposed to just people just simply using the wrong terminology. So I do have an entire rant about that, which I will leave linked. I have several vlogs where I discuss this as well, which I will also hopefully leave linked. And yeah, today we're just going to talk about book recommendations. Today's going to be a positive one. Think of it as the antithesis of my rant video. How about that? So yeah, historical context, as I said, skip ahead if you just want to get straight to the books. So for the historical context, we have these two time periods, which actually encompasses more than two time periods. We actually are talking about the reign of 4 monarchs in Britain. So at this point, we are in the Hanoverian period of Britain, and we are in the mid to late modern era. The modern era is the era that begins with the discovery, or better yet known, colonizing of the Americas. It starts around then in the late 1400s, early 1500s is more correct. It ends with World War II. So that is that time period that we are talking about. And the Hanoverian period starts with the rule of George I in the 1700s and ends with the death of Queen Victoria in 1901. So we have a time period that is known as Hanoverian because it's from the House of Hanover. These are monarchs that were brought in from Hanover, so they were originally German. Most of their surnames were German. It isn't until the death of Victoria that we see it change to Windsor, and that's for political reasons, not for any birthright reasons. We're not going to get into that because that's post-Hanoverian. This time period specifically that we are talking about is the end of the reign of George III throughout the life of Queen Victoria. So we're talking just over a century. Regency period has 2 to 3 different variants. You have the actual Regency, which is when King George III had a serious mental health break. He did start to degenerate seriously, and eventually Parliament said that his son needed to be a prince regnant, so he needed to rule in his father's stead. So his father wasn't in a mental health state to be able to abdicate the throne. So that meant that they couldn't ask him to abdicate, but he couldn't rule either. So that's where we put a regency on him. This is the only time this has happened in British history where we have had a regent, a long-term regent for an adult monarch. I might do a video on just the House of Hanover if you want to know a lot more about the time period in a lot more detail. But basically, we had now the Crown Prince, or the Prince of Wales, now becoming the king, the de facto king. He did all the things that a king would have to do responsibility-wise in his father's stead, because his father was not in the mental health capacity to do so. It starts in the procedure started in 1809. I think it finally gets passed through Parliament in 1811, and it persists until the king's death in 1819. We have a 9-10 year long period where this is happening. That's the actual regency. That is the era of the regency. However, when we're talking about fashion, when we're talking about society, a lot of the time we tend to encompass more. So some people date it all the way back to the early decline of George III, so post loss of the colonies, and when we are starting to see the prince really needing to step in a lot more in his father's stead, do a lot more of speaking before Parliament in his father's stead, etc., which starts in the 1790s. We basically just also encompass George's reign, because George was a mess of a king, George the Fourth this is. So the Prince Regnant, once he takes over from his father, his rule also is then also sometimes encompassed into the regency. Following the prince's rule, he had no legitimate surviving children at the time of his death, so the crown passed to his brother William. So this is where we have William the Fourth. And William is king. Basically, he holds on for dear life until his niece, the Princess Victoria, is of age where she could rule without a regent, because he hated Victoria's mother with a passion. He hated the Duchess of Kent. So then it passes on to Victoria. So over the two time periods that are known as the Regency and the Victorian era, we have four monarchs, which are George III, George IV, William IV, and Queen Victoria. And of course, William, he ruled for 7 years, so he didn't rule for very long, so he often gets encompassed into Victoria's reign. So a lot of the time when you're talking about happenings in the Victorian era, you might actually be talking about William. He also sometimes gets encompassed into the Georgian era being George the First, Second, Third, and Fourth, and then it's just William who's there to kind of ruin everything until the Victorian era. So the 7 years of Williams are either encompassed into the Georgian era or encompassed into the Victorian era. It very rarely gets referred to as part of the Regency era, because we are way past that at this point. He becomes king in 1930, so we are a good 11 years past the Regency at that point, and it's already a bit of a stretch to encompass George the Fourth into the Regency period, so it gets a bit complicated. So we have in the Regency era, in terms of fashion, we have what's called a draped look. A lot of what you see in the Jane Austen ones, where you see it's a little bit more fixed around the bust area, but then everything else just kind of drapes down in an almost ancient Greek style, just very loosely fitted. A lot of leaving things to the imagination going on there. And then a Victorian era is known a lot more for that hourglass shape, a lot more of the corsets and that type. So we have very distinct fashions, but culturally we have a very distinct thing going on. During the Regency era, we still are very much in before the decline of the aristocracy. The decline of the aristocracy starts to happen, I guess, under George, especially with the loss of the colonies. Therefore, the peerage are still marrying amongst themselves. So the nobility are marrying mostly amongst themselves. They might at a push marry down into gentry, but they won't be marrying anyone else. It will only be peerage or people who ancestrally have peerage heritage, which are the gentry, right? Gentry are distant relations to the nobility, but they don't have titles. Think Jane Austen's characters, they're all gentry. So Darcy, for example, not nobility, but very wealthy and probably has aristocratic ancestry. He just didn't inherit a title. His father's father's father might have been the son of kind of a nobleman, if that makes sense. But they won't be marrying any lower than that. Even the Bennet sisters or any of Jane Austen's characters would not be marrying nobility. It would not be happening. We have a shift that happens in the Victorian era. So since we've lost the Americas, and since the inventions of steam power and the Industrial Revolution, we're starting to see a shift in who has money, because the way that the aristocrats were maintaining their money and their lands is no longer working, it's no longer viable because people are leaving working the land for working in factories, which means that now during the Victorian era, we suddenly have where people who previously would have been excluded from the conversation are starting to make the real money. This is where we start to get big entrepreneurial endeavors. So people who previously been looked down on, people in trade, are starting to have more money than the aristocrats. It's the rise of the bourgeois. So we are now having trade class. Suddenly, a lot of the aristocrats, they don't have a dowry for their daughters. They don't have the money. They don't have the same kind of dowry they used to have. And a lot of the aristocrats themselves are wanting the money so that they can keep up their lifestyle. So what do? We start marrying heiresses. If you're presented with the option of a duke's daughter with a small dowry, or you are presented with an American entrepreneur's daughter who is going to have a hella dowry, we're going to marry the heiress. We're going to marry the entrepreneur's daughter instead. So yeah, we're starting to see a shift in who is marrying who and who has the power, which just wasn't happening in the Regency era. We're also starting to see the beginnings of movement. So we've seen the Slave Act, the first Slave Act pass in 1811 is when we see that first pass, which disallows anyone on British soil to own a slave. And then finally we have the Slave Abolition Act happen under William, I believe it is, in the 1830s. So we're also seeing a shift in who is generating the money as well. So all of these things are starting to happen that are really shifting society. So the societies between Regency and Victorian are incredibly different. Bear in mind that the Regency era is very tumultuous for the upper classes because we have seen not only the loss of the colonies, but we have also seen across the channel the French Revolution, which means that then a lot of them are wearing these draped clothing. They're not wearing over the top jewelry. Instead, they'll show their wealth through lace instead. So they'll have like lace cuffs instead, because it's so much better than wearing like really garish jewelry, because then that makes you look a little tiny bit too Marie Antoinette. So yeah, we have two very distinctive time periods that are in a huge amount of social shift. So I'm going to recommend some books that are based on each of these time periods. So let's get to it. All right, we're going to start with the Regency period, and the first one I have is Regency Fairy Tales by Olivia Atwater. Now Olivia Atwater does have a Victorian series that is still ongoing. Only one book is out so far. I haven't read that though, so I can't talk about those. But I will talk about her Regency ones, and that is the Regency Fairy Tales. This starts with Half a Soul. In the first story, we are following a woman who got attacked by a fairy, and he began to take her soul, but he only managed to take half her soul, so now she's a little bit of a liability. We do have a debutante season going on in here, which is very characteristic of the Regency era. Still very much happening throughout all the way until now. We still have a season. By the way, we still have a debutante season for those of you who care. The second one is much more of like a fairy tale retelling of Cinderella, but if Cinderella weren't nobility, who had been forced into servitude, but was just someone who was a servant. So we have a little bit of like a upstairs, downstairs kind of vibe going to it as well, which I really appreciated and I thought was handled really well. And then the third one is a sapphic romance in which we are following a investigation, I suppose. The next one we have is Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, and this one is I suppose it's two magicians who have conflicting views on magic and also about the way that information gets gate kept, I suppose. And I really liked the conversations that were had in here. I thought this book was a little bit overlong. I'm not going to lie. I'm not one of those that thinks that this is the best book that's ever been written. But I really appreciate this book, and I really do appreciate the artistry that goes into the craft of this book. It's definitely one of those that is very, very meticulously written, and you can tell. I really do like the way that society is depicted in here. We also do see George III, so this is very clearly Regency era because it is when George III is not all there, and we can definitely see the way that that is affecting society, the way that the turbulence of this shift in monarchy, especially from a king who previously had been quite stable politically to his son who is a lot less stable politically. So that's an interesting one as well, and I really did enjoy the conversations that were had from that. We see a lot of the actual historical events that are happening during this time period as well, which I always appreciate when we show real historical events happening, especially if we're providing any kind of commentary to them. So yeah, I had a great time with it, and I would recommend, if you are looking for something that is Regency era that kind of feels almost like it was written in the Regency era but is very much an epic fantasy. The next one I have is one that I liked. I didn't love it as much as I'd hoped, but I did still enjoy, and that is The Midnight Bargain by C.L. Polk. This one is a story that is following a young woman who wants to be a mage instead of be married off, and there's a lot of the commentary in here that you see a lot in Regency of like, why should I have to marry someone I don't love just to save my family's fortune? There's a lot of commentary of that in here, but it also adds the extra layer of why should I have to give up who I am for my family? Why should I have to give up my ambitions for my family? Why should I have to give up education and knowledge for my family? So it's a little bit more than just why do I have to give up love, which is what you normally see. So I think it adds layers to that in an interesting way. I just would have liked to have cared a little bit more about the characters, and especially because we are also presented with a romance in here, I would have liked that. But we do have a little bit of women giving up parts of themselves in a more literal sense in this story that I think was a really worthy conversation for the time period. So while it wasn't like new favorite territory, it does do a really good job on the commentary that you would expect from the time period that I think if you are into Regency, you could still very much enjoy. One of my favorite Regency series out there is the Miss Percy's Guidebook series by Quenby Olson, the first one being Miss Percy's Pocket Guide to the Care and Feeding of British Dragons. This one is a story in which we are following Mildred Percy, who is a little bit older. I think she's in her late 30s, I could be wrong, whose uncle dies and then she inherits a dragon egg. And as dragon eggs do, it hatches. And it's the first dragon that's been seen in England since probably Arthurian times. So she's a little bit bewildered on what on earth it is that she's supposed to be doing. So then with the help of the local vicar, who happens to be our love interest, also his housekeeper, I think she is, they go on an adventure to try and figure out how to deal with this dragon. And it's so wholesome and it fits all of the vibes that you would want from Regency. Jane Austen herself could have written this in a way, not in a grammatical or writing style sense, but tonally and the vibes and the chemistry between the characters and the interactions, the satire, all of that very, very Austen-esque. And if you're a fan of Jane Austen and would like something that's a little bit more modern, but also shows a slightly older character and also that has dragons in it, then I would recommend you check out this person. One that is well loved, not particularly my thing, but that is indeed well loved, is the Shades of Magic series by V.E. Schwab. This one shows, I think, very early Regency, if not, like I was talking about in the intro where I was talking about in the 1790s, we start to see a bit of decline of George III, and therefore we start to see an increase in the amount of involvement politically that we have from George IV. I don't know if it's that or if we are actually in the Regency period by this point, because our protagonist Cal, who is in this world where there are multiple worlds, and he is one of the few people that can travel through. There are multiple Londons, there are 4, so they're all parallel universes that are all connected by London. Cal can travel between all of them, and when Cal comes to Grey London, which is our London, obviously in the Regency era, he does come to try and talk to George III. So he clearly has a better relationship with George III than with George IV. But George IV is a lot more involved now. So it seems like it's either very early Regency or we're like in that prelude that leads up to the Regency. Not necessarily my thing. I love the concept of it. Theoretically, fantastic. Love it in theory. So many really original and strong ideas in there. And there were certain things about it that were really immersive. The world building and descriptions are very, very cool. It didn't grab me as much as I wanted it to, but I know this is a very popular one and it is very well loved, so it seems sensible to put this on this list. If you're looking for a fantasy that is set during the Regency era, you really can't go wrong with this one, because by all accounts most people seem to love it. One that I think is woefully underhyped, one that I really, really like, one that I think more people should have read, and it is a Pride and Prejudice retelling but with dragons, and that is, of course, Heartstone by L. Catherine White. The first book in this, impeccable. A perfect retelling of Pride and Prejudice if you're going to do it fantasy style. Granted, we do have a kind of fridging situation with one of the sisters. I think if this book were longer, it should have been handled better, but I've kind of given it a pass, and I suppose down to each individual person, especially because it's not to further the plot of a man, it's to further the plot of a woman in a time period where women had very little agency and very little say. I do love the way that we've redeemed certain characters. I think that Charlotte Lucas is portrayed better in this book than she is in the original, as is Caroline Bingley. The redemption of Caroline Bingley is in this book. I had a great time with it. It felt a lot more feminist to me. Obviously, not to critique Jane Austen for the time period that she lived in. Her books are incredibly feminist, but for a modern audience, if you're not kind of wanting to throw women under the bus for your feminism, I would highly recommend this one. We also have a better rendition of Lydia in here as well, Lydia Bennet. Mary is also treated in a very different way as well, and kind of valued for her differences a lot more. So I really appreciated this one. I really loved how female centric it was. I really liked the dragon element to it as well. I think that was really important. Catherine de Bourgh is fabulous in this as well. So if you're wanting all of these women amped up to the dozen and you want to fall in love with them all over again, I would highly recommend this series. There are several other Pride and Prejudice retellings but with dragons that I would recommend for this time period. We have Spellbound at Pemberley by Abigail Reynolds, which I personally really loved. We have Miss Bennet's Dragons, and we also have Pemberley Mr. Darcy's Dragons. So we have quite a few of those going on. I would recommend any of those if you want a Pride and Prejudice retelling. I think they're all enjoyable. I'd say my favourite of those three is probably Spellbound at Pemberley. So if you are wanting something that feels a lot more whimsical, it also feels a little bit cottagecore somehow in vibes, even though we're at Pemberley. But yeah, I really enjoyed that. So if you want any other kind of like dragon fantasies that happen to have the Pride and Prejudice characters or plotline in it, I'd recommend. Any of the other Pride and Prejudice variants as well that you can think of. Love at Netherford, for example. Obviously, Pride, Prejudice and Zombies, or any of the other quite classic Jane Austen retellings. Any of those, any of the kind of Jane Austen fantasy variants, I would also recommend. I really enjoy those, and I think that they do, a lot of the time, they do a really good job of adding to the critique that Jane Austen had already presented us with in the first book. There is your fantasy Regency recommendations. Now let's move on over to Victorian. The Dangerous Damsels series by India Horton. This one starts with the Mysterious Society of Lady Scoundrels, and it is absurdism fantasy. Think Terry Pratchett meets Jane Austen, and here you got it. We have women who are badasses, we have land pirates and houses that can move, we have societies of witches, and we have espionage a la James Bond style way before James Bond. And I really enjoyed this series. Do I absolutely love it? Is it a new favourite series? Not at all. Was it a heck of a lot of fun? Yeah, it really was. I had a great time with it. It was funny, it was engaging, I really loved the characters, I loved the way that the women were portrayed in here, and I loved the way that societies were portrayed in here. It has such a vibe of women from that time period. Any association of women, like groups of women who are part of like an embroidery group or any of those things, this is how you picture it. Just the level of catty pettiness, the level of grabbing for power because they're in a society that grants them none, so having power over your knitting club is probably the most amount you'll have. That whole combo, that whole spiel, fantastic. Had a great time with it. So one that I have read recently, and I'm not going to talk on too much because I do have a spoiler vlog in the works that's coming in summer, Belladonna by Adeline Grace. This one very much feels like a gothic Victorian story. It's exactly what you would expect of a Victorian society in terms of the pettiness almost that you would get from upper classes are really trying to cling on to power, and you can really feel that social dynamic shift happening in real time, and you can really feel that in this book. We are following a family that have come up through money, not through titles, but we are also following our protagonist who has a hench inheritance due to family. So we've got like an interesting crossover going on there that I think is handled in a really fascinating way. I love the way that the fashion and the way that even the buildings, but also like the way the food is described, etc. All of that is great. I love the romance in here as well, which I think is really amped up in this society of we're desperately scrambling to keep lineages as pure as possible. Really, really well executed. And if you want, again, more thoughts on it, then I would recommend you check out my vlog, which again is coming in summer. One of my personal favorites when it comes to romances, especially Victorian style ones, is The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern. This one is kind of like The Prestige, Romeo and Juliet combined. We have two characters who are thrown into the Night Circus, which is this magical circus. They are basically needing to outshine each other's magic. It's a contest to see who has the best magic of the two. Things go slightly unfortunately when the two happen to fall in love with each other. And yeah, I really did enjoy this one. It does a really good job of displaying manipulation. We also have a great display of the time period. The magic in it is stunning. But above all else, the writing style is gorgeous. I love it so much. Next up, I have two that are not actually technically Victorian. They're not Victorian because even though they're the right time period and they are set in our world, they're not set in England. So they're not in a fictional version of Victorian England, and they're not in real world England. They are in the real world, but in Mexico and Argentina, I think one of the settings is. So therefore, these are books that I would recommend if you're a fan of Victorian periods, but you are not really wanting it to be exclusively England. And the first one of those is The Beautiful Ones by Silvia Moreno Garcia. This one has all of the trappings that you would expect from a Victorian romance. You have the family that are trying to marry this girl off, and this girl's trying to find a balance between love and duty and all of the things that you would expect. She also has magic that she is kind of allowed to show as like a parlor trick, but she's not really allowed to show much more because they don't want her to be perceived badly. And I really appreciated that one. And then the other one that we have is The Daughter of Fortune by Isabel Allende, which again, very similar in premise to what you'd expect from a lot of other Victorian romances, where you have a young woman who, in this case, she's being treated as though she is part of a Victorian upper class family, but she is not. She clearly is brown and therefore is in this weird limbo of she'll probably inherit wealth and therefore she is going to be desirable to some, but obviously the fact that she's not white makes her undesirable to others. And then eventually she ends up falling in love with a revolutionary who does not believe that European powers should be having any influence in the Americas, and it goes from there. So I really liked both of these books, and like I said, they're not technically Victorian, and I think it'd be disingenuous to call them Victorian because Victoria is not their queen, for starters. But if you like that time period but you're wanting to branch out a little bit more, I felt like recommending these would still be fine. Returning, however, back to Victorian periods as we know it, we have The Once and Future Witches by Alex E. Harrow. I love Alex E. Harrow's writing. She's one of my favorite authors. I think that she does a really good job of social commentary. This is very feminist. It is the suffragettes movement meets the witches movement. The suffragettes movement is late Victorian, and this is the rise of the suffragette movement, so it's very much still late Victorian as opposed to early Edwardian. We see a lot going on in here to do with women's rights, which I really love seeing, and I really liked that we kind of also critiqued a lot of the women's movements as well, where a lot of women's movements were based on socialism, they were based on equality. Some of them were very much like, we need to do this the proper way, we need to go through the correct channels, and therefore it was very much like only rich women are actually going to get a say in this kind of thing. So that division that was happening amongst the women's rights movements that were happening and the critique of it through the witches movement, I thought was really cool and I really appreciated. So I would highly recommend, if you are wanting a critique on feminism within feminism as opposed to from like a patriarchal standpoint, I would highly recommend that you check this one out. If you are a fan of The Night Circus, we have The Winter Garden by Alexandra Bell. In this one, we are following a young woman who, when her mother dies, she visits the Winter Garden and it kind of brings her solace, and then the Winter Garden disappears and then she spends the rest of her life searching for it. So when she comes into her inheritance, she decides that she's going to spend that money to go and find the Winter Garden. And we are also following her best friend, who is the daughter of an entrepreneur, and she herself is a artificer, so she is able to create mechanical animals that seem very alive. We're following a huge critique of the time period and of the society and of the way that power imbalances work, not only between the sexes but also between the classes, in a way that I found really refreshing and very emotional. This is a book that I would definitely recommend. You really need to check content warnings for, though, because there are quite a few unseen problems happening here that I think you would need to be in the right mental health space for. It is for a purpose and it does critique things in a way that I find I appreciate, but it's just something that I think you should know in advance. The next one that we have is an anti-colonial one, and that is Babel, or Babel, however you want to pronounce it, by R.F. Kuang. And this one is anti-colonial academic story. It's a dark academia that is critiquing the way that colonialism infiltrates academia. I really did appreciate this one in terms of the conversation it was having. It's not my favorite R.F. Kuang. My favorite R.F. Kuang is still The Poppy War, but I did really appreciate the way that it was discussing language. As someone who's really into languages myself, I really did appreciate the way that it talked about how translation works and how easily it can be misrepresented. As we are seeing now by a lot of historical texts being revisited by scholars. For example, I'm really excited to try is there Emily Wilson versions of the Odyssey and the Iliad, where it's been retranslated with the hope of at least minimizing the amount of bias in the translations. The fact we're seeing that come to the forefront, Babel is so relevant in that sense of trying to have those conversations about, just because you've read a book that's really old doesn't mean that you're actually reading it correctly, because it doesn't mean it's been translated correctly, it's been translated with bias. And the magic system isn't ideal in there, and I think that was my kind of biggest biggest problem with it. The point of it was to discuss the way that language functions within academia and the way that a lot of the time translation especially is used to uphold biases as opposed to break them down. One that is just cozy and I thought I'd talk about right after Babel, which is heavier, is The Honey Witch by Sydney J. Shields. I really did enjoy this one. It was so cozy. I really love the romance. It's sapphic as well. It's witchy. We have a young woman who has decided that she really doesn't want to marry any of the men that she's been introduced to. So when she's offered to become the next Honey Witch by her grandmother, which means that she's not allowed to fall in love, she takes it immediately, only to find a young woman there who does not believe in magic and does not believe in witchcraft, who she then feels compelled to prove wrong, and therefore they have to suddenly spend a lot of time together. And it's how do we break this curse on, honey witches not being allowed to fall in love. I really enjoyed this one. I think it did a really good job of showing romance and this time period and the whimsy and cottagecore in a way that I really liked. And if you want something cozy, I'd recommend. One that is a little bit more in the Gothic Victorian style is an author that I've already talked about before. That is Quenby Olsen, but this time with The Half Killed. This is a relatively short novel, if not a long novella, somewhere in between the two. And this one is following a young woman who can see beyond the veil and has decided to try and take her life because she cannot bear it any longer. She fails at doing so and then gets roped into an investigation. So we have like a murder mystery investigation going on, we also have paranormal going on, and we also have a romance going on. And I think that this combo was handled in such a fantastic way. I really did enjoy it. I think that Quenby Olsen's doing a great job of tackling this time period, the whole Hanoverian period. You can really feel the distinction as well between her Regency and her Victorian, which I very much appreciate. So big shout out there. And yeah, if you're wanting something that's Victorian and a little bit atmospheric, especially for the autumnal seasons, then I would recommend this one. And the very last one I have to talk about today is one that is basically a YA romance, and that is The Rose Bargain by Sasha Payton Smith. It's one that I read very recently. I read it in a vlog. I will leave it linked. And this one is a story in which we are following a young woman who needs to join the bargaining season, the rose bargaining season, which is basically when you're presented at court, but you are also, because the queen is a fae queen instead of Queen Victoria, you get to do a bargain with the queen that will most women usually use to enhance themselves in some way, shape or form to make themselves look more marriageable. Again, it being set during this time period, during the decline of the aristocracy, is interesting. Obviously the circumstances have shifted a little bit because we have a fae queen who is immortal, and that shifts things a little bit. But I do think it was really interesting. We're following a young woman who is joining in the race to potentially become the prince's wife. I think that the way that we discuss marriage seasons for women was really interesting in this one. I don't think that this one necessarily felt any more Victorian or Regency. So if you're a fan of Regency, this one will be fine. It was just more like the fashions and the aesthetics that made this one more Victorian than not. I enjoyed my time with this one. I would recommend it. Is it revolutionary? No, not in the slightest. But if you want a fun, easy, predictable YA romance, I'd recommend. So yeah, that is all for those recommendations. Let me know if you have any other recommendations for either Regency or Victorian, or simply if you have a book that you know falls into one of the two but you're not sure which one. Leave them down below. Let me know if, like I said, you want me to do one based on kind of like all the time periods of British history. I'm more than happy to do so. And yeah, hopefully I will catch you in another one soon and I've not bored you too much or scared you off a little bit with my level of nerdiness. I'm hoping that you've gotten some recommendations out of this and that you will stick around for more. So with that being said, I'll hopefully catch you in another one soon. Bye.